Morning, everyone. Mr. Blake.
Thank you. So this morning we're going to hear from Ms. McEwan.
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence that I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing
and nothing but
and nothing but the truth.
Thank you. Can you give your full name, please?
Karen Anita McEwan.
Thank you very much. Ms. McEwan, you should have in front of you a witness statement behind tab A or tab A1. I'm going to ask you to turn to that, please. Is that statement dated the 17th of September of this year?
Yes.
Could I ask you please to turn to page 74?
Yep.
Can you confirm that that is your signature?
It is.
And can you confirm that that statement is true to the best of your knowledge and belief?
I can confirm.
Thank you very much. That witness statement has the unique reference number WITN 113-60100, and that will be published on the inquiry's website. By way of background, you hold a first-class honours degree in psychology, is that right?
That is correct.
You have 30 years' experience in specialist HR and operational management roles for large organisations.
That's true, yes.
Can you assist us with what specialist HR is?
Years of experience, formal coaching and formal training through businesses like Tesco, and my degree, obviously, which is hugely relevant to my vocation.
Thank you. You worked at Tesco from 1981 to 2016, is that correct?
That's correct.
Including as UK People Director. Is that head of a particular team, part of the management structure?
It was part of the operational management structure, and I led the people function for the UK, which was all of the stores, distribution and support centres.
In 2016, you moved to become Chief People Officer at McCall's Retail Group, is that
That's
right?
correct.
And you moved up the ranks to become Interim Chief Executive before it was purchased by Morrison's, is that right?
That's right.
Most relevant for today's purpose, you became Chief People Officer at the Post Office in September 2023.
I did.
I want to start by looking at your induction. Paragraphs 15 and 16 of your statement, you have said that you didn't receive any formal induction or training, and you took a number of actions yourself speaking to people. Can you assist us with why that was?
I think at that time, obviously, I reported directly to Nick Reed, who was the Chief Executive, and Nick was extremely busy during that period. The people function itself was not staffed very well, and people were under a lot of pressure in that function. And I just think there was just no time to do a formal induction process.
If I could bring up onto screen your witness statement, it's WITN 113-60100, and if we could look at page 7, please. I'll just read a couple of sections from this page when it comes up onto screen. Thank you. It's page 7, paragraph 21. You say there, I did not have sufficient understanding of the context of the business and felt I should have been told more about it before I started. I had not fully appreciated the stress that the business and the executive were under, or that I was expected to and needed to start work on an urgent basis to begin to help to fix the issues in the business was experiencing and support the executive team. This meant that whilst my background and relative experience allowed me to move into the role without difficulty, I did not have a pleasant or comfortable introduction into the business. At paragraph 22, you also say, about halfway down that paragraph, however, upon joining the post office, it became clear that the scale of my role was more significant than I had anticipated. The level of expectation of my working hours and visibility across the business made it necessary to take on a rental property in London to be able to manage the demands of the business. This has impacted my personal life. Where did the original expectation come from in respect of the work that you would be required to do?
I wouldn't attribute that to any individual telling me that. It was just apparent, given the experience that I had had in other businesses. I could see that things were less stable than I might have understood. So it didn't come from any individual. It was just my understanding and my observations of the business at that time.
And what was your first impression of how the business was run?
Do you mean generally?
Yes.
I didn't form an observation on how it was run initially, because I would have expected to have had time to consider that and to have understood properly exactly how things were working. I think specifically with the people function, it was chaotic.
You had worked with Mr. Reed before at Tesco. How well did you know each other? What was your relationship?
We had never worked together. We both were on a management development programme in around 2002, I think, from memory. We didn't work together. We had a 12-week or so programme where we had got to know each other as part of a group of about 16 people. After that time, I didn't have any further contact with Nick at all until I joined the post office, or just before.
And what was your initial impression of how he was running the post office when you joined?
So I felt initially the business looked like it was well run, and Nick's reputation was, as I knew it, from someone of integrity, and he had experience and was highly regarded in his role at Tesco. So that was the impression that I brought to the business with me.
And in respect to the chair, Mr. Staunton, at that time, what was your initial impression of Mr. Staunton?
I'm afraid I didn't have a very good impression initially.
And why was that?
Though I think until any personal encounter that I had had with Mr. Staunton, it was a general demeanour that I felt made me and other people feel quite uncomfortable in terms of his behaviour, certainly in and around the office in London.
You say in your witness statement that onboarding wasn't typical of a large organisation. What do you mean by that?
That there was just no formal process. So it was obvious that I would have to self-initiate that process and get to meet with the people that I felt I really needed to meet with. It just was unstructured and less structured than I would have expected. There just wasn't a formality to the process.
Who was responsible for onboarding at that time?
I think primarily it would have been the Chief People Officer, but as I joined, there was nobody in that role, and one of the existing team was being asked to step up to cover that role. So the focus on that probably wouldn't have been as one would have expected.
Are you now responsible for that role?
I am.
We've heard that your post was one that changed hands a lot, and you've addressed that in your witness statement. You've given some reasons for the pressures that people were under in that team. One of the reasons you say is that members felt undervalued. Can you expand on that for us?
On initially joining, I was very keen to get as much information about the culture of the business as I could, and I asked the team very open questions. This is the people team, the people that I would have been responsible for managing effectively in my role. I just feel that they felt that the efforts that they were making and that they were putting into the business were just not appreciated, and they were finding it very difficult to make progress, unsurprisingly, in the circumstances.
When you say the circumstances, do you mean the fallout from the Horizon scandal, the inquiry, or something else?
Yes, definitely, but also just the lack of leadership in that function at that time, and the lack of attention that the function had.
The other reason you've given is that people were unable to affect change within the business, and you say including how performance was managed. What do you mean by that?
I would say the biggest and most common thread of the feedback that I had at the time from the people was that they felt that there was performance in the business. There were people who were not performing to the standard that would have been expected and that was necessary for the business at that period of time. And they felt that there was not enough rigour, not necessarily in the policy or the process, but that there wasn't enough rigour in the application of those processes so that people were held accountable for poor performance or poor behaviours in the organisation.
Was that something that was specific to that point in time? Do you think it was something that went back further?
I would suggest that it was exacerbated by the issues that the business had at that time, but I suspect that it had gone back further, probably due to the constant change of people in my role. I would imagine that wouldn't have been helpful.
Having worked in that role in a number of different companies, is that something that's typical? Do chief people officers tend to move around a lot, or is that something that was a particular problem for the post office?
It's certainly not. I've only worked in 2 employers previously, but certainly not in either of those organisations, and it wouldn't be typical, I would suggest, in an organisation of the size and scale of the post office. No.
In terms of corporate memory, how did that present itself when you first joined?
The executive team had also changed quite frequently, and it was difficult to get consistency in the information that I was trying to get to understand about the business to go about my job. So I would say it was fragmented. There were certain parts of the business that had stability, and people were more confident in those departments and those areas, and there were other parts of the business where people were less confident and there had been more change.
I want to ask you about the scope of your role and the limits to your role. Are you in charge of recruitment?
Yes.
Managing those who are currently in the business from a human resources perspective as well?
That's correct, yes.
Onboarding, something we've discussed. How about other areas of the business? Where do you see your role as fitting in?
In terms of directly managing, or in terms of having
Yes,
influence?
your responsibilities.
I would say the role of the Chief People Officer is to lead the agenda on people across the organisation, so that doesn't extend to postmasters, but it extends to anybody that works for and is contracted to work for the post office.
I was going to ask you the direct question. Presumably, you focus on employees of the post office. Is that fair?
So my role focuses on employees, but my view of the role, and I think this is really significant and very important, is that the performance of people employed by the post office in the organisation have a direct impact on the relationship with and the confidence and the trust with postmasters. So I see the role as intrinsically connected to the postmaster population. And I think that's extremely important. But in terms of my direct responsibility is for the colleagues of the post office.
Could we please bring onto screen poll 004487885? There's no real significance to this particular document. It's just an example of something I'd like to look at. This is a board report of which you are named as the author and sponsor, and it relates to a contract for PR services. Under the executive summary, it says, as a result of events that have occurred since the start of 2024, the Post Office has required a substantial increase in services from Cardew. Cardew is a PR firm, is that correct?
It is.
First bullet point, the increased public scrutiny has arisen and the knock-on impact this has had on the Post Office's brand. and Cardew backfilling the vacancy left by Post Office's departing Director of Communications. So to what extent does your role also involve the obtaining of contract for services?
So at that period in time, there was no incumbent Communication and Corporate Affairs Director, and I was taking some line management accountability for that function to help and to support the executive and Nick, who there was a lot of pressure in the business at that time.
We'll see with you and with other witnesses quite a lot of expenditure on external firms. There will be those who query whether the Post Office, or why the Post Office considers it necessary to contract out those kinds of services. What's your view on that?
I understand that, and I definitely understand that in the context of this particular contract. And I think it might be important to explain some of that context for the inquiry.
Please do.
At that time, this was a pre-existing contract that was already in place and was actually due for retender this autumn, actually this month coming. At that time, I think I've referred to it elsewhere in my statement, the business was in significant distress, and not only for the wider business, but for the communications team as well. It wasn't a normal time, and the events, I think the media attention that the business was under at that time, the challenges that we had a lot of, again, lot of levers in the team. It was important, I felt, to get support for the team, but I was very conscious at that time that there had been criticism in the media about the expenditure on corporate affairs and on PR support for the business. So I was acutely aware of that at the time of making this decision. I think when I extended the contract, I was very keen to point out to Cardew that the caveats for this extension would mean that there would be as much focus on internal communication for our colleagues and Postmaster communication, because at that time the business was being challenged on its employer brand. So we were struggling to recruit senior positions, certainly in my function specifically, because of the brand of the Post Office at that time, frankly. And I'd asked Cardew to ensure that there was as much focus, not just on the executive, that almost seemed to be less important than the focus that we needed on internal and Postmaster communications. So they brought in some specialist support to help with that as well.
And how's that going to work going forward?
Well, I think we're over that peak period of the volume now, and we have recruited. At the same time, we started a search in the market to replace the Corporate Affairs and Communications Director. We have now replaced that position, so that I think there'll be more stability and more consistency.
Going back to the issue of induction, you've given evidence about your own induction. You've personally made changes to the induction process. You've set those out at paragraphs 25 to 33 in your witness statement. You address Horizon scandal training. Can you briefly summarise what that involves?
It was just further raising awareness for all colleagues onboarding, pre-joining the Post Office, so that they had context. And we set out a recommended reading list and reference material for people to do on a self-taught basis prior to joining, but then reinforce that training as people join. So there was an online training module which is available to everybody that raises awareness of exactly what happened right the way through from the judgments and to subsequent actions that the business has taken.
Was there anything addressing those topics before you joined in terms of training?
Yes, there was pre-existing training prior to my joining, I believe, yes.
Have you seen that training?
I have seen it, yes.
And what was your view of the quality of it?
At the time that I reviewed it and in the context of the business, I felt that more rigour was needed in terms of the amount of material that people needed to read and comprehend to properly understand their roles before they joined.
There's been quite a lot of focus in the inquiry on issues in the legal team and issues in the investigations team. Is there any additional training that's provided to the legal team or the investigations team in light of their role in matters being investigated by the inquiry?
Not to the best of my understanding, no.
Do you think that it would be worthwhile having additional training for those teams? Or do you think that the process that you've already put in place is sufficient?
No, I think it may be worthwhile in doing further training with those teams and any other teams that require it.
Moving on to the people plan, could we bring up onto screen poll 004584553? What is the purpose of the strategic people plan?
In this business, probably more than any others, it was very important to get some formality and some structure about the way that work was being conducted by the people team. And I think I referred, and you asked me earlier, about some of the reason for the chaotic state of affairs, really, when I joined. And I think a lot of this came down to the fact that there wasn't a clear plan for the business or for that function, and it was important to establish the function within the business to get credibility and get belief in the work that the function was trying to do. And I think it's extremely important to have a plan, some focus and some measurable targets and actions that I and my team can be held to account for.
And was this a plan that you personally implemented?
Yes.
Could we please scroll through the plan? Over the page, please. If we can continue going over and over. We can stop on that, on the final page, page 7. One matter that has already been highlighted by Sir Wyn this morning is this plan doesn't address sub-postmasters, does it?
It doesn't.
I think you've said in your witness statement that and you've said also this morning that in your view, improving the culture within the post office will also improve the experiences of postmasters. Can you just expand on that and quite what you mean by that?
I think that's absolutely critical. I think that it's fairly all-encompassing, but I would say from onboarding people properly, to making sure that they're sufficiently trained, making sure that they have awareness of the issues and the wrongs of the past, making sure that we have people that work for us that have the right behaviours and the behaviours that are expected in an organisation, and all of that gives people the confidence and capability to do their jobs. And that's fundamentally important in building trust with postmasters. So whilst I don't have contractual responsibility for that population, I believe that my role is to do everything I can to make sure that the people in the organisation are sufficiently capable.
A counter-argument to that might be that it cements a them and us attitude between employees and sub-postmasters. Whose responsibility would it be to develop a plan like this to improve the relationship with sub-postmasters?
I think specifically at a detailed level, the retail team and the postmaster-facing team would be very much involved, but I believe it's the job of the executive team and of the chief executive as the ultimate owner to ensure that the postmaster relationships continue to be a focus of priority for the business.
Are you aware of a strategic plan similar to the strategic people plan to address sub-postmasters?
I haven't seen a plan, but I know that there are efforts in the business to do that, yes.
Could we please bring up onto screen our YouGov expert report? That's EXPG 607. I Did you see this evidence being given in person, or have you read the report?
I've read the report in my additional documents as preparation for the inquiry.
Thank you. Could we please turn to page 40, where it addresses certain statements about the leadership board at the post office? If we look at the first two of those figures in figure 28, we can see there that in terms of the statement that generally Post Office Limited is trying to improve its relationship with sub-postmasters, there's a net disagree figure of 51%. And secondly, a statement, generally Post Office Limited understands the concerns of sub-postmasters, a very strong net disagree of 74%. It seems as though there's quite a lot of work to do there in respect of that relationship. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that, yes.
Is that something that you're aware of having been discussed at executive level?
Yes, definitely. It's a constant conversation. I mean, I haven't seen those stats before, but seeing them highlights how much work there is to do. So, but yes, it is discussed.
And what do you think can be done to fix that relationship?
There is a need for transparent communication, and I think in building any relationship of trust, that's critically important. So there's more work to do there, definitely, in terms of talking about the plans that the business has, whether it's their strategic plans on proposition or whether they're plans to generally support the postmasters. I think we can do a better job of communicating those plans.
Do those figures surprise you at all?
No.
And having had conversations at executive level, are they figures that surprised members of the executive team?
I can only speak for my own perception, obviously, but I would be surprised if the executive team didn't expect there to be dissatisfaction from postmasters about the relationship. Yes.
Thank you. That can come down. Thank you. I'm going to move on to the CEO position. Does the CEO's appointment and CEO remuneration issues, do they fall within your remit?
Not directly, no. So the CEO appointment is a matter for the shareholder, and the CEO remuneration is also a matter for the shareholder, but I am a member of the remuneration committee.
And in terms of the CEO appointment being a matter for the shareholder, what role does the Chief People Officer have in that?
I mean, obviously, I haven't experienced that particular role being searched for at the post office, because obviously when I joined, Nick was the chief executive and he was incumbent and has been in the role since I've been here. I would expect to be consulted from a best practice perspective on how we would search for that role in market. I would expect, given that I've now got some experience at the post office, to be consulted about what I saw to be the significant issues that needed to be addressed in that role. So I guess I'm saying I would expect to be consulted, but not necessarily involved in the decision making about the appointment.
Who would take those kinds of matters forward? Let's say we've heard that Mr. Reid will in due course be stepping back. Who will take forward the appointment of a new CEO?
Do I think that will be a matter for Nigel Railton, the new chair, Lorna Grattan as a shareholder representative, and Amanda Burton?
Thank you. We've heard quite a lot about the CEO's remuneration. What is your view of the sufficiency of the CEO remuneration to attract top talent?
It's quite difficult in terms of comparison, because I think compared to the wider market in more commercial businesses, which frankly are the businesses that I've only had experience in, then currently the remuneration is probably definitely not upper quartile, I would expect. So it isn't significantly high, is what I'm saying. I think compared to obviously other remuneration packages in the public sector, there might be a different view of that. Yeah.
That's quite similar evidence, the evidence given by Amanda Burton, two extremes. But if the chair is looking at recommendations for the future, ensuring that the post office has the best people leading it, what is your view of the remuneration package?
I would agree with the statement, firstly, that it's important, it's critical that the post office has the right leadership team to take it forward. I would consider it possible to recruit somebody capable and proficient at the current level of remuneration. But I would also expect that there will be other candidates probably that we would want to approach and that would be suitable candidates that may not want to come to the post office due to their view of the remuneration. I think it's a job that one has to want to do because there's a public service to be done, and I think that's very important as well.
Could we please turn to poll 0044861? This is the investigation report that was carried out by Marianne Tootin, a barrister, in relation to complaints made or raised by Ms Davies. We've addressed this previously. We're addressing it, and Ms Davies has been named because she's been previously named, for example, in a select committee. We're not going into great depth in relation to each and every allegation, but I'd just like to take you to two matters that arise and that are relevant on this issue. The first is relevant on this issue. You were the commissioning executive in relation to this report, is that correct?
I wasn't initially the commissioning executive, so that was somebody else was the commissioning executive. But then as the investigation started, due to a conflict issue, I was asked to take on the role of the commissioning executive once the investigation was underway.
And what did that involve?
So I was part of a panel, oversight panel, the investigation, along with Amanda Burton and Lorna Grattan.
Thank you. If we could turn to page 5, please. We're going to stick to the CEO pay position, and that is allegation 2.10. The allegation was that Mr Reid bullied Ms Davies in relation to the messages he sent concerning his dissatisfaction with his pay. The analysis is on page 15. If we could turn to page 15, I'll just read a few paragraphs from that analysis. Ms Tootin finds that Mr Reid did not bully Ms Davies in respect of the message he sent her concerning his dissatisfaction with his pay in January 2023. She says, Mr Reid had been dissatisfied demonstrably with his remuneration package for some time, with numerous attempts being made by former chairs of the Post Office to seek an improved package from the government. Ms Davis, Mr Reid and Mr Staunton discussed the topic intensively during the first 2 months of Ms Davis's employment in particular. Mr Reid suggested that he would resign or take action unless matters improved, with increasing frequency and feeling during January 2023. From Ms Davis's perspective, I appreciate that she must have felt under pressure to improve his pay, given the intense focus this issue received and Mr Reid's increasingly strong suggestions that he would leave the post office or take action. That said, some of the pressure may well have been self-imposed by Ms Davis in her desire to succeed where her predecessor, Ms Williams, had seemingly failed. Mr Reid's messages were at times demanding, impatient and irritable, which he may wish to reflect upon. However, they were on balance not of an offensive, aggressive or humiliating nature. They were not of that severity. Furthermore, Mr Reid explained to Ms Davis that his dissatisfaction with pay predated her time at the post office, and he did not blame her for the situation. Mr. Reid spoke to others, including Mr. Staunton, about his dissatisfaction with his pay in similar terms. There was no finger pointing at Ms. Davis. If we scroll over the page, we can see the recommendation. She says, nevertheless, the Post Office will no doubt wish to ensure that the future chair is aware of the history of requests made to the government in respect of Mr. Reid's pay to ensure that his expectations are managed appropriately moving forward. Has that recommendation taken place? Have you had discussions with the chair?
I haven't had any personal discussions with the chair. I would imagine that Amanda Burton would have taken that up. I haven't discussed it with the chair.
What's your view of the relationship with government and having to ask the Department for Business or the Secretary of State to improve the pay of the CEO?
I think having come from other corporate businesses where we still would have to answer to shareholders, that is in keeping with my experience. I think it's important that there is strong governance and rigour around how executive pay, as well as the chief executive, but including the chief executive, is managed. So it's important. There are occasions where I feel that we don't maybe have as much autonomy as we ought to have to make decisions regarding pay at a more junior level. But I think at the level of the executive and the chief executive, it's important that that is in place and that rigour is applied, yes.
When you say at a more junior level, who do you have to obtain authorisation from in respect of the pay of more junior employees?
So that's determined by threshold of the value of the pay as opposed to the individual. So it's individuals over a certain level we have to seek approval for, which mainly confined to the executive and the senior leadership team.
And what change would you make to that?
I don't think there are any further changes to make to that at the moment. But if we did want to go outside of those parameters, for example, if we were looking for somebody new to come into the business, we might have to get approval for that. But there aren't any current changes in plans for that team of people.
While we're on this report, if we could perhaps turn back to page 5. I'll address this now just because we're on the report and I don't want to have to return to the report. But if we scroll up to the top, we have the allegation relating to Mr. Staunton. That's allegation 2.7. During a meeting on the 25th of January 2023, Henry Staunton, former chair, referred to women as pains in the arses, and at the same meeting said of one candidate for the Remco chair position, words to the effect of, "She doesn't look coloured, where does she come from?" And in view of her age, referred to the same candidate as a girl when other women were referred to as ladies. If we please could turn to page 12 and 13, there's the analysis of that allegation. As I said, this isn't the forum to investigate the particular allegations, but I'm looking at the business's response to the findings of this report. Ms. Tootin sets out the allegations there at 27. At 28, she says, Mr. Staunton's remarks were discriminatory on grounds of race and sex, and therefore not in accordance with the dignity at work policy. The remarks go well beyond his characterisation of them as potentially politically incorrect statements, and she sets out her reasoning below. If we could please turn to paragraphs 29 and 30, those are passages that I'd like to look at. Paragraph 29 says, consideration should be given as to whether equality, diversity and inclusion training should be offered to non-executive directors, including the future interim or permanent chair. Alternatively, such training could be a mandatory requirement for any non-executive directors involved in external or internal recruitment processes where they are acting as a representative of the post office. Just pausing there, is that something that falls within your area of responsibility?
Yes, it does fall within my area of responsibility.
And is it something that you have taken steps to address?
Yes, I have.
And can you briefly summarise the steps that you have taken in that regard?
So we have, after a several months search, actually, we have just appointed a specialist in EDI for the business, which I felt was critical, who reports into the talent and capability director, who's ultimately responsible for this area, and will be producing training for every member of the post office team, including the non-executive directors and the board.
Thank you. And paragraph 30 says, I was also concerned by remarks made by Mr. Staunton in respect of his outdated view of the speak up process and investigations, the latter of which he said notably were a cancer in the organisation, and the impact such views can have on workplace culture. It was very troubling that those remarks were made by the then chair of an organisation that is grappling with the most serious of institutional failings. In looking for a new chair, it should be a key consideration for the Post Office and the Department for Business to assess whether prospective candidates have good experience of helping to foster a workplace culture in which any concerns relating to, for example, EDI, discrimination or whistleblowing can be raised openly without fear of intimidation or retribution. The current chair is only an interim chair. Is there a recruitment process ongoing for a new chair?
I believe that there will be a permanent process being run, yes.
In respect of paragraph 30, are those matters within your area of responsibility?
Not strictly for the recruitment of the chair, but this is one of the areas that I would expect, obviously, to have some involvement in, given my previous experience, yes.
Are you aware of that process or anything similar having been undertaken in respect of Mr. Railton before he was appointed?
I'm not aware of that taking place, no.
Thank you. That can come down. Paragraph 164 in your witness statement, you have said that Mr. Staunton had asked you to close down the investigation. Can you assist us with your account in respect of that, please?
Yes, he had asked me previously or talked to me previously about investigations more generally in the business. So I was aware that he had a dim view of the processes, and he did in a comment to me also use the terminology that it was a cancer in the organisation, specifically related to the investigation into Jane Davis. He asked me to close down the investigation and do everything that I possibly could to make sure that happened.
Close down the investigation into Mr. Reid, into himself, or more broadly?
So at the original time, there were several conversations about this. At the initial conversation, the investigation as we knew it only related to Mr. Reid because some of the comments had not been particularised until the Employment Tribunal claim was laid. Then the claims were particularised and I became aware that they pertained to Mr. Staunton, yes. So at that time, he was asking me to close down the investigation into Nick Reid.
From your understanding and from what you heard and saw, were you of the belief that he understood that the investigation was also into his own conduct?
So certainly after November, when the Employment Tribunal claim was particularised, and yes, I was of that belief.
And did you have any specific conversation about the investigation into him with Mr. Staunton?
So Mr. Staunton didn't refer to his own investigation or the elements that extended to him specifically, but he did persist in asking me to close down the investigation, and it was my belief at the time that the motivation to do that was not as I had been told by Mr. Staunton.
What do you mean by that?
Mr. Staunton said that it was in respect of his concern about Nick Reed's well-being, and I didn't believe that to be true.
And what opinion did you have?
Sorry, could you repeat the
What
question?
was your view?
My view was that that request was self-serving on Mr. Staunton's behalf.
Did you hear Mr. Staunton's evidence to the inquiry?
Yes, I did.
And what is your view now?
My view remains the same.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to the group executive and the senior executive group structure.
Just before you do, I don't want details, but it follows from what you said, I think, that Miss Davies brought an employment tribunal claim against the post office, presumably.
Yes.
Has that been concluded?
No, it hasn't. I think
Right, then I won't ask
my
anymore.
understanding is it's filed, but not yet heard, sir.
Right, that's fine. Let the employment tribunal do its work.
In respect of the group executive, you have identified issues with the group executive before it became the senior executive group. Paragraph 77 of your witness statement, you have said that it was untypical of senior leadership groups that you have been part of. Can you expand on that for us, please?
I would say specifically the lack of experience, and particularly in the context that the post office had at that time. So training, experience, and whilst, I think I say this in my statement, whilst there was not a shortage of commitment, it was a matter of capability.
Where in particular were the problems?
I would say particularly in the retail-facing functions. But that wasn't confined to that. It wasn't confined to just one individual. It was a general view that I held.
And is that the function that interacts with sub-postmasters?
Yes, it is.
What would you say is the cause of that problem?
I think it's largely down to selection of the individual for the role against the requirements of the role. So there probably was a shortfall in terms of experience or capability of the individuals in the job. And then as a business, we probably didn't react quickly enough to some of the areas of underperformance that had started to appear and manifest, particularly given the circumstances that happened earlier this year.
Who in particular was failing in that regard?
So it would be the direct leaders of the people in question, the executive team. But ultimately, of course, the chief executive has accountability for performance in the organisation. I would say, though, that for the year before I joined, I know I've repeated this several times, but the lack of having strong people representation in that group is undoubtedly going to have consequences on the performance in the organisation.
I know you've said that it isn't just individuals, but I think we're getting the impression that there is certainly at least an individual who, in your view, was underperforming. Who was that individual?
It was the chief retail officer.
And who was that?
It was Martin Roberts.
Thank you. You've also given the example of being asked to give an opinion on a matter which was not within your area of expertise. Are there other examples of failings in that regard?
For me individually, No, I recall one example, I think, of abstaining from a decision because I felt that I wasn't qualified to do so. But it's my belief that at that time, there was a reluctance for people to not say when they didn't understand and feel obliged to make a contribution to things that they maybe weren't necessarily qualified or had the experience to contribute to.
Paragraph 79 of your statement, you've said that members of the wider management population felt they couldn't trust the group executive. Can you expand on that for us, please?
Yes, I think intuitively, and this is not factually based, but intuitively when I started, I detected that was the case. And I ran a couple of sort of voluntary forum groups. Not all of the representatives from the senior leadership population came, but they were quite well represented, and I did several of them over my first few months, and members of that team told me that at the time, and members of my own team had also said the same thing. So there was consistency in what I was being told.
Were there particular individuals who they felt they couldn't trust?
So they didn't cite particular individuals. It was the it was kind of commonly referred to as the GE, as it was at that time, the General Executive Team.
I think you said that was quite a big team at that time. Is
Yes.
that right? You changed the structure. Was it instigated by you, the change of structure to the senior executive group?
I think before I joined, Nick and Owen Woodley, who was the Deputy Chief Executive, had been considering whether or not the structure was right anyway. But I would say on joining and having conversations with Owen, I think I'm probably having a fresher perspective would have instigated the action that we then took, yes.
And what were the principal structural changes to the group?
So we narrowed down the group, which may seem odd, given that the business was under pressure at that time and was quite complicated. But to speed up the decision-making processes, it felt important to confine that group at the most senior in the organisation to the people that had the relevant skills and experience to do those jobs. So we thinned the group quite substantially. And we were also at that time, it wasn't the only reason, but we were also at that time concerned about the bandwidth of the chief executive, of Nick, in terms of the number of direct reports that he had, but also the size of the job that he had to hand as well. And as I said, it wasn't the only consideration, but it was one of the considerations.
Looking at the problems that you identified with the original group, if we take the lack of deference to subject matter experts as one of the complaints, has that been overcome by these structural changes?
Yes, it has, yes. I think, as always, the dynamics and the behaviour of a group running a business has to be constantly under review, and we have to have the right checks and balances in place to make sure that that is the case. But I feel confident that it's far better than it was when I joined, yes.
Taking the other issue, the lack of trust, has that issue been resolved?
Just a very difficult thing to measure, of course. Yes, I think to a great extent it has. And from the conversations that I've since had with the senior leadership population, I think they feel more confident that the behaviours of that group, the executive group, are in keeping with what they would expect. And I think that has given people confidence that change has definitely been made, yes.
Could we please turn to poll 00446673? This is a strategic executive group report of the 1st of May of this year. has you down there as the sponsor of the report. Can you assist us with the background to this report, please?
So yes, this is the full report, the board report, of the colleague engagement survey that was taken earlier this year.
Are you aware of issues as to whether sufficient information was passed to the board based on this report?
So I feel very confident that this report and the report that went to the board is what I would consider to be best practice, and that's what I've been told since. So I'm confident in the quality and in the comprehensiveness of the information that was given to the executive and to the board.
And did the report accurately reflect the results of the surveys, for example?
Yes, it does.
If we could turn over the page, please, we have the headline results. I'm just going to read a couple of them. Paragraph 3 says, the overall outcome report was shared with the Strategic Executive Group on the 23rd of April 2024. It has also been shared with the Create New Confidence Leadership Team Group. Can you assist us with who the Create New Confidence Leadership Team Group are, or what their purpose is?
Sorry. So this is, at the start of the year, after changing the strategic executive group, we wanted to give the senior leadership team some key focus areas to work on, and this is one of the focus groups. So they were the group that were responsible for giving us ideas and communicating the survey, but giving us ideas in terms of further improvements. Yes. So they were a cohort group within the existing management population.
If we scroll down, please, I'd like to look at 4D. It says the level of strain felt by senior colleagues at Post Office is substantially different to the level of strain felt by more junior colleagues, and this is impacting their well-being. The predominant descriptions of the Post Office culture for junior colleagues are friendly and supportive, whilst for senior colleagues they are bureaucratic and political. The barriers which have the highest impact on strain have decreased for junior colleagues whilst increasing for senior colleagues. Proximity of senior colleagues to governance processes is likely a cause of strain, and job and organisational design should be reviewed for senior colleagues. Can you summarise for us what the issue here is?
It's quite a lot to summarise. Sorry, I'm just trying to think of how I can best say this as succinctly as possible. So I think the comments on bureaucracy apply to the levels of process that those people have to apply to get change executed in the business or to make things happen. And the political behaviour, my belief is that would refer back to the references to the general executive group in terms of the political behaviour there, maybe. But I think it's really centred around how difficult it is to see processes that the team have to go through to get things done.
And it seems as though the solution might be changes to the job and organisational design. Is that something that has taken place?
It's something that's in the process of taking place, yes.
And how do you foresee that happening?
I think there needs to be more clear lines of accountability and demarcation between responsibilities, so people are very clear on the elements of their role which are within the confines of what they're responsible for, and that there's clarity, but also that we have roles that are duplicative in the business as well, and that causes confusion and also gets in the way of getting things done. So I think there's a need to organise work better, simply put, and to have the right people in the right jobs.
And who's taking that forward?
That's my responsibility to take forward.
Do you have a timeline for implementation?
We're doing the work at the moment to, constantly evaluating the structure of the business, like I guess in any other business, but we're sort of specifically looking at that over the next, we've started and we're looking at that over the next few months, yes.
Could we please turn over the page and look at F? F says, poor internal communications are driving a lack of colleague confidence in both Post Office and the senior leadership. 43% of colleagues suggest that the one thing they would do to make Post Office a better place to work is either to improve internal communication or be more honest and transparent. In most businesses, suggestions to make the business a better place to work tend to centre on improving pay and benefits or improving progression opportunities. So the overwhelming feedback on communications at Post Office suggests this is a real area of opportunity. Can you assist us with that?
It's surprising that it's so important. So I think that paints the picture of what people's expectations of us are as a leadership team, and is giving us very clear signposting and emphasising the need to communicate, I think, with colleagues and with postmasters. I think it's very important that we take heed of that.
And are you aware of work that's ongoing in that respect?
Yes, work has definitely started in that respect.
And can you point to any concrete steps that you think will change that concern?
We have regular, every Wednesday we have a regular communication that Nick in the past has led, and now Neil Brocklehurst has taken over from, where we do a kind of weekly communication on business performance, changes that we're making. There might be issues on some elements of the people plan that we want to communicate, or colleague wellbeing, for example. And they're attended physically with the people that are in the office, and then there's a broadcast. And then every 4 weeks we do a fuller, more comprehensive meeting, again led by the executive team. And at that point, people are able to ask questions of the executive team, or each other, frankly. And most recently, and this has been a really positive step forward, we've had postmasters as well attending those meetings and speaking to the post office team and the post office colleagues about their life as a postmaster.
Is that something that's formal, that's going to happen every so often?
There's a plan to make it happen regularly and often, and to do more in that respect as well.
Does that have a particular name, the group that met with the sub-postmasters?
We haven't, I don't think, from memory, sorry, that there may be, I'm not familiar with it having a name, but I think there's a strong intent, and our Director of Corporate Affairs and Communications is taking responsibility for making that happen.
Thank you. That can come down. At paragraph 99 of your witness statement, you have said that there's a perception that the organisation is not as open as it could be. Is that a perception, or is that reality?
There is definitely work to do. So I think there is a sense of reality, but I also think that there. I think there is. It is a reality. Yes, I think we could be more open.
To take an example, Callum Greenhow of the NFSP has given evidence to the inquiry about a meeting on the 29th of May this year. I think you were present at that meeting. Is that right?
I've been present at a couple of meetings. If they're the meetings I think you're referring to, yes, I have been present definitely with him at a meeting, yes.
He has suggested that information was given to him about the new NBIT system, but that didn't mention a number of concerns that we've heard about at this inquiry about the quality of the NBIT build and about cost. Do you think those meetings with the NFSP have been as candid as they should have been?
Apologies, I don't recall that specific conversation happening, I'm afraid, at that meeting at all. I think I can talk confidently about the intent going into those meetings. And I know Nick had asked the whole of the executive to try where we possibly could to sort of show representation, genuinely to meet and listen to the views of Voice of the Postmaster and the NFSP and the CWU. So we all attended for that reason. So I think the intent going in there definitely would have been to have open dialogue and to take constructive challenge from those groups of people about how we could better run the business. But I can't recall the specifics of that meeting, I'm sorry.
I appreciate that NBIT is not your area of responsibility, but looking at NBIT, do you think that there is sufficient transparency about the future in regards to that system, from what you've seen and heard within the business?
I think because of what I've seen and heard and listening to the view from Postmasters and other people, I think there is definitely opportunity to improve the openness and transparency of the progress, yes.
I'd like to turn to a anonymous letter. Can we please bring up on screen poll 004484111? This is a letter that you will have seen. It's from a group of people who have called themselves post office whistleblowers. It was sent to a number of people, including the chair, members of parliament, and the inquiry. In the third paragraph, it says, since March, the Post Office has conducted 2 opinion surveys, one directed at postmasters, the other at Post Office employees. Both results are shocking and serve to demonstrate that the culture within the Post Office is significantly worsening. Despite Mr. Reid confirming in a parliamentary committee meeting in January that improvements in culture were being made, this is not true. We're deeply frustrated that despite several requests to see the full results, we are being denied access. Is this something that fell within your area of responsibility?
So the Postmaster survey, not, but the colleague survey, yes, that's within my area of responsibility.
Are you aware of this specific allegation?
I wasn't aware until I saw this in preparation for the inquiry very recently. I didn't know that that was the allegation.
Can you speak to it at all in terms of whether you're aware of any requests to see the full results and not being granted?
Yes, I attended the board meeting to present the results on the colleague survey, and at the same time, the team that were responsible for the Postmaster survey also attended at the same meeting, so I happened to stay for the whole session, which was very comprehensive. We covered the detail of the Postmaster survey. This is not the YouGov survey, sorry, this is the internal survey, and the colleague survey in detail with the board. We'd also covered both of those same things at our executive group meeting beforehand. And we have fully communicated the results, certainly of the colleague survey. I can speak with conviction to that element through the business at every level. And we've been very comprehensive. So we haven't sanitised any of those results. We've provided full and comprehensive detail to every business leader to then share with their teams. We have protected anonymity in the smaller groups from the verbatim comments, but frankly, the verbatim comments roll up into the themes of the survey anyway. So there's no chance of any ambiguity about the results of the survey.
Thank you. The letter then goes on to raise a concern about people being managed by Mr. Reid. If we scroll down, we can see a complaint about those who are said to have conflicts of interest, and we'll get on to Project Phoenix and the Past Roles project shortly. If we go over the page, please, there's just something that's said about you that I'd like to give you an opportunity to respond on. And it's the second paragraph. I think we're going to actually have a version of this that doesn't have the redactions on, but it doesn't matter for today's purpose. It says, who are the new executives coming on board too? Karen McEwan is well known to Reid. They work together and have kept in touch over the years. How she got appointed within weeks of her predecessor departing tells us that this is another cover-up and Reid is simply surrounding himself with his own type. How would you respond to that allegation?
I mean, it's just totally untrue. So, as I said, I was on a management development programme with Nick 20 years ago. We genuinely have had no contact since, and that's particularly of relevance because at the time that I was at McColl's, Nick was at the NISA group, and there could have been an opportunity then, given that I was an executive member of the team at McColl's, for us to have contact. And even at that point, we didn't make contact at all. I had no contact with him. Coincidentally, I had written an email to Nick the week before I got approached by MBS Executive. I had no idea that there were any vacancies in the post office leadership team, but by mutual contact from Tesco, suggested to me that I wasn't working at the time and that I would be very helpful to post office in some way, shape or form, and that I should contact Nick, and suggested that I contacted him. I wrote him an email, and I actually said in the email, I'm not sure whether you all remember me. I didn't even know that Nick would remember who I was 20 years later. So to read that my appointment was less than cloaked in integrity is disturbing. Though I was approached formally, I was interviewed formally as a candidate for that job, genuinely, and I had no contact with Nick over that time. I also don't know that it would have been problematic if I had been in contact with Nick. I wouldn't have been ashamed about that, and it certainly wasn't a cover-up, but genuinely we hadn't been in touch for a 20-year period.
Thank you very much. That clarifies that matter. Can that letter please come down? Moving on to non-executive directors, what is your view, if you have one, on the balance between the number of executives and the number of non-executive directors on the board?
So in terms of the number, it feels appropriate and it's in keeping with my previous experience.
Thank you. In respect of the Postmaster non-executive directors, do you consider that works in principle?
That the role works.
Yes.
I think it's fundamentally important, and it definitely works insofar as both of those individuals give a good, honest representation of issues mattering most to postmasters. So I think the role is invaluable, and I think in other organisations, other boards should work hard to take the same principles.
Do you have any concerns about any conflicts of interest in that respect?
No.
Are there other ways in which you consider that sub-postmasters or sub-postmaster experiences can be built into the business in some way?
Yes, so we have a Postmaster Experience Director. He's a recent appointment, and he's a serving Postmaster, and he's doing really well in bringing to life the issues that are live and happening for postmasters. And in fact, he's been instrumental in bringing the postmaster to the meetings that I was referring to earlier. So that's a role that I think we should continue to heavily focus on and heavily champion. And I think as an executive team, it's very, very important that we have a close and trusting relationship with him, and that he feels he's able to talk to us and tell us about issues that he might be experiencing in getting things done in the business. I think that's really important.
Do you know who instigated that role?
Sorry?
Do you know who instigated that particular role, the Postmaster Experience Director?
I'm not entirely sure who did, no.
And that's Mr. Eldridge?
It is, yes.
Are you aware of how he manages to balance working as a sub-postmaster with also taking on this role at the post office? So
every conversation encounter that I've had with him, he's very positive and has never said that he's not able to cope with that. And I think he seems really capable, and he's got a really good both commercial background and a postmaster background. So I'm confident that he would tell me if he didn't think he was able to balance it, and he does seem to be able to do that, yes.
Is he in some way supported by a team at the post office, or does he attend on his own?
So I think I think he wants to retain a degree of independence, I think, but also he will be supported by the retail team, and I think he has a good relationship with them, yes.
Perhaps we could bring up onto screen poll 004 58458. I think this was the advertisement for, or job description for that role. If we could scroll over the page, please, and if we could look at page 5. If you could scroll down, there's a section there that says, where does this role fit with the rest of the team? And can you assist us with that, please?
In terms of whether this happens in practice? Or,
yes.
Yeah. So, yes, that is, as I see it, in practice, yes.
So who holds the other roles?
So the engagement director role is held with Tracy Marshall, and the group chief retail officer was Martin Roberts, but obviously we've made the changes to that function. So temporarily, Pete Marsh is stepping up interim cover for the chief retail officer role.
And you've previously, in your evidence, expressed some concerns about the previous holder of that role. Do you have confidence in the new individual who holds the role, or is stepping up to the role?
Yes.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to another topic, but that might be a moment to take our morning break.
All right. What time shall we resume?
If we come back in 15 minutes, so 35 minutes past. Thank you.
Okey-doke.
Thank you. I'm going to move on to cultural issues. Paragraph 70 of your witness statement, you have referred to the behaviours framework that was launched. And I'd just like to bring up onto screen, if I may, your statement, WITN 113-60100, page 24. Is the behaviours framework something that you are responsible for?
When I consider the formulation of it and the communication, yes. In terms of overall accountability, I think the behaviours are the responsibility of everybody in the business.
Thank you. If we could bring up page 24 of your witness statement, please. It's paragraph 71. You say at 71, one of the 4 key behaviours is own the outcome, which I'm confident will help drive the changes in ownership and accountability we need to see. The other key behaviours are be curious, move it forward, and back each other, all of which are critical to cultural change. To a group of lawyers, that sounds like a lot of words and not much else. Can you assist us with really what that means in practice?
Yes, I appreciate that, how it doesn't read literally. I think owning the outcome means for people to take responsibility and accountability, which is obviously critically important given the history of the Post Office, to take their job seriously, to fulfil it to the best of their capability, and to make the decisions and own the consequences of decisions that they take. In terms of be curious, this is particularly relevant because the Post Office has been accused of, and understandably so, a lack of curiosity, a lack of seeking to find the truth in any circumstances, even when seeking the truth is difficult. It's very important that everyone in the organisation asks questions, feels comfortable to question people particularly when they're more senior, actually. Moving it forward is the acknowledgement that sometimes good is better than perfect. And what I mean by that is that there is sometimes I think that sometimes stifles performance, so people feel that everything has to be perfect and everything is going to be scrutinised, and rightly so in some cases, but it does sometimes hinder progress. So we wanted to encourage people to feel that they were giving their best and their best was good enough. And backing each other is fairly straightforward, but that means to support each other through times of difficulty and challenge.
Issues of culture are quite difficult to monitor. Is there a way in which achieving those behaviours can be monitored?
Yes, we're taking that extremely seriously. So rather than a series of words, and I appreciate when you see this in the statement on a piece of paper, it can look like a half-hearted promise, but we're very serious about it. So right the way through from ensuring that all of these 4 behaviours are embedded in our recruitment practices, for example. So we've got a framework to help people who are interviewing to seek out these behaviours and to make sure that the people that we recruit to the post office have the right values and the right behaviours. And actually that's arguably as important, if not more important, sometimes than the technical expertise, if we have the right people, particularly on curiosity, for example. So we're building it into the recruitment practices and processes that we have. We are building it into progression through the business. So I think in the past I referred to people maybe ending up in jobs that they weren't totally capable of doing. That's critically important. And even if that means letting people down when they think that they're going to be capable, but they're not, whether we have to have more scrutiny as an organisation on that. So as well as subject matter expertise, we'll be looking for these behaviours and identifying those behaviours in individuals before we promise anyone a bigger job, a bigger pay package, and more responsibilities. These are the individuals that are leading an organisation in a hugely and very critical time of change. So they're important.
That can come down, thank you. In terms of culture towards sub-postmasters, we've seen in evidence the letter from Mr. Reid to the Lord Chancellor in January 2024 regarding the potential exoneration of sub-postmasters. Is that a letter that has been discussed with you at all?
So is it possible to remind me? So can I see?
I don't have the number to hand, but it's a letter in which Mr. Reid set out the number of appeals that the Post Office was likely not to contest as against the higher number of those that would be contested. If it's not something that you're aware of... It's not
something I remember at all, I'm sorry.
Fine. Could we, in that case, please turn to poll 00448-653.
Apologies, I've got a completely blank screen.
No, that's okay.
Is that
in
normal? There's nothing happening on my screen at all. It's completely black. Sorry.
Is it changed now, or is it still black?
There's nothing here.
So we may need to pause for a moment while somebody has a look at it.
Properly, but at the moment I've got the screen back. Thank you.
Thank you. Could we please then turn to poll 00448-653, and that is what we know as the Project Pineapple email. Over the page, please. Was this something that you saw around about mid-January of this year?
Yes, it is.
If we could scroll down, please. I'd just like to take you through a few of the complaints that were set out in this email, just to see whether any of those fall within your responsibility and what has been taken forward and what hasn't. So if we start with the first paragraph, there are the concerns expressed regarding Mr. Taylor and a feeling by management and even members of the board that still persisted that those postmasters who have not come forward to be exonerated were guilty as charged. So that's a similar complaint to the complaint about the letter that I was asking you about that you hadn't seen.
Yes.
In respect of that particular allegation, not just against Mr. Taylor, but a broader allegation that sub-postmasters are seen as guilty as charged who haven't come forward to be exonerated, are there any steps that you personally have taken in that regard?
I mean, obviously, as a member of the executive team, I take that very seriously, and it definitely isn't a feeling or it's just definitely not something I'm familiar with at my time in the post office. I've never heard that, and I don't believe, to the best of my knowledge, I don't believe that anybody that I work with in the organisation feels that's true, that's the case at all.
If we look at the second paragraph, there's a complaint there about Mr. Roberts and certain members of his team. I think you've mentioned Mr. Roberts already. Is that a matter that you have personally taken forward?
So the subsequent investigation into this complaint was handled by a member of my team, yes.
And is Mr. Roberts still in the organisation?
No, he isn't.
Thank you. And is that a result of action that has been taken?
No, it isn't. It's just...
The next paragraph is a complaint about the power wielded by Mr. Foat, General Counsel. Is that something that you have personally been involved in?
This particular part of the statement wasn't totally new to me because Henry Staunton had mentioned this previously when I was having a conversation with him about the investigatory processes that were in place at the time. So I think that sentiment was not as much as a surprise as some of the other elements of the letter.
Is it something that you have looked into, and is it something that you feel action needs to be taken or has been taken?
Yes, we are and have looked into it. Every element of this was subject to a very thorough investigation. So we've broken this down and have investigated on all of the matters. As I said, this view that was held at the time about Ben Foat was something that I was definitely familiar with. Though,
is it something that you have taken any actions in respect of?
So I think the action that I am and have taken is more all-encompassing action to improve the culture in the business more generally and to ensure that the executive and management and everybody lives to the values and the behaviours. We haven't I haven't specifically taken any action in respect to Ben Foat, no.
If we scroll over the page, please, there's another complaint there regarding Postmaster non-executive director membership on all committees, including REMCO. What's your view of that?
I think Amanda Burton referenced it in her evidence. I think it is helpful to have representation of all non-executive directors at some of the committee meetings, yes.
In terms of REMCO, I think you've said, are you a member or do you just attend?
I don't have any voting accountability, but I attend the meetings. I'm responsible and accountable for preparing the papers for that meeting.
And in your view, would Postmaster non-executive director membership of that committee be helpful or unhelpful?
It would be helpful.
Thank you. Could we please turn to poll 004485999? And we're now looking at the fallout from the sharing of that Project Pineapple email. If we scroll down to the bottom of the page, Mr. Foat has emailed Nick Reed and he says, The Project Pineapple email contained very serious allegations of which I have not been made aware. Given the circumstances, I would be conflicted. This is, I think, do you know what the context of this email is?
How I read it at the time and looking at it now, my belief, but I don't know this to be the case, but I think you'd have to ask Ben Folk, but my belief here is that there are inferences made about his conduct and his treatment of postmasters, which when he read the email were the first time that he had been made aware that there was a perception or there were any allegations against him. So I think the point that he's making here is that he didn't know, but now that he does know, clearly we wouldn't be able to carry on with the investigation because he would be in a position of conflict. So I think that's the point that he's making.
Thank you. And he says, Karen and Ben T, it would be helpful to have a conversation with you. Did you have a conversation with Mr. Foat about the Project Pineapple issue?
Yeah, I did have the conversation on the day that the email came out, yes.
And can you assist us with what was discussed?
So Ben was very distressed, and I think on that day and at that time there was a lot of anxiety in the business, and particularly with the individuals that had been in receipt of the email and who were named in the email. Because of the sensitivity at that time, Owen Woodley and I decided that we would take responsibility and take control of the situation effectively, and therefore we were the only two members of the executive that were in contact with people, and we sort of divided responsibility effectively to call those people to try and to settle them down, bearing in mind that we'd got to worry about business continuity, and there was already, at that period in time was our most critical period of time, and we were all very, very concerned about people's well-being, but also about running the business. So I had the conversation with Ben, and he was very distressed.
Did you speak to the sub-postmaster non-executive directors around this time?
I did, but not immediately. So I think it was at the beginning of the following week. I think this happened from memory on a Friday, and I was in contact with Ben, I remember, on that day, and then subsequently Martin Roberts over that weekend, and I spoke to Saf. I don't recall speaking to Elliot, but I spoke to Saf on very early in the beginning of the following week, yes.
Could we please turn to poll 00460000? And this is the investigation report that was carried out by Nicola Marriott into this particular issue. Was this something that you commissioned or asked to be carried out?
Yes, so at the time of the Project Pineapple email, which was the middle of January, it was clear that once the dust had settled and we had made sure that the people that were named were as composed as they could be, it was obvious that we needed to take some action. And we decided at the time that Nicola Marriott would be the most suitable person. She's extremely experienced and very thorough, and has a very good perspective of the criticality of postmasters in the business as well, which I thought was important. So she would understand probably better than anybody the need for a kind of very rigorous approach to the investigation. So she set about doing that work in the beginning of February, yes.
Could we please turn to the bottom of page 15 and we can see the summary of her findings. She says there is a consistent theme of lack of effective communication and updates into the board sufficient for Saf and Elliot to fully understand some of the issues raised, how they're being handled, and in some instances why things have taken so long. If we scroll down, based on this investigation, I do not believe there is a toxic culture towards postmasters still prevalent within the post office, or that there is an intentional attempt from current employees to prevent the Postmaster non-executive directors from having access to relevant information. However, I can understand why some of the situations outlined by Elliott and Saf could be perceived in this way, and the recommendations will address the need to improve flow of information to the board, as well as clarify the scope of the Postmaster non-executive director role, including what is appropriate in terms of engagement outside of the board, with subsequent engagement on this to all relevant stakeholders. The reference in that conclusion to not believing that there is a toxic culture towards postmasters still prevalent within the post office. Do you think this investigation was sufficient to have reached that conclusion?
I would say, in reading and analysing that particular line again, that is quite an all-encompassing statement, yes. I think trusting that Nicola will have had the best intention in doing this investigation, I think from the interviews she conducted and the people that she spoke to, I think she's there from the best of her knowledge, stating what she believes to be right. But I think it would be impossible, with hindsight from the extent of that investigation, to be able to make that comment with conviction.
We've seen recently, for example, the investigation into Mr. Jacobs and correspondence from an investigator to him as part of that investigation. Did you hear that evidence?
No, not specifically, but I am aware of it.
Do you think that there are still potentially wider cultural issues that might mean that, in fact, to some extent, there is a toxic culture towards postmasters still prevalent in some aspects of the business?
Not to the best of my knowledge, but I do believe that there is still a lack of capability in the organisation that needs to be addressed. And I believe that there are also still issues with the infrastructure and the operating model of the post office, which I think I talked earlier about accountability being in the right places. I don't think that's helpful. And I do also think that maybe the communication isn't as transparent as it could be, not for any malicious intent, but either because of those capability issues or because people are still worried about the consequences of saying things that may be controversial or admitting that things are not right. So I do think that there is still that feeling within some members of the post office colleague population, yes.
Thank you. Paragraphs 153 to 157 of your witness statement, you have raised an issue and you say it wasn't minuted as part of that investigation. Can you assist us insofar as you're able to with what that issue is?
So could you just wait for this to come up? I can't see it at the moment, sorry.
Would you like to see your witness statement?
Yes. Oh, sorry, yes, please. Yeah.
WITN 113-60100, paragraphs 153. That's page 52. We can't look into the truth or otherwise of what was said to Parliament, but if you're able to assist us with what the broad allegation was that you say was not minuted as part of that allegation.
Sorry, yes, I'll just remind myself.
153 to 157.
Yes, this relates to one of the two. I was asked about whistleblowing complaints in the business, and this relates to one of the two whistleblowing complaints that I was aware of at the time of writing my statement, yes.
So it wasn't minuted because, so as to protect the identity of the whistleblower or for some other reason?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
I think your witness statement suggested that there was intentionally something not minuted within that investigation.
No,
Perhaps
that
that's a
wasn't. No, that wasn't what I was intending. No.
That's fine. Perhaps we can then move on to Project Phoenix and past roles. That can come down. Thank you. Did you understand the difference between Project Phoenix and past roles at the beginning?
Do you mean at the beginning of my time in the post office?
If they were both ongoing at that time? Then
They
yes.
were both ongoing, and no, I didn't immediately understand the issues. The differences, sorry. I understood what was broadly being looked into, but I didn't immediately understand the differences, no.
When did you become aware of the differences between the two?
So I had started asking questions about it because it obviously related to extremely important matters, and I felt that I should be aware of them. And I'd ask questions probably from not long after I joined, probably at the end of October. And I established a broad understanding. At that time, I wasn't accountable for the work, but I got a broad understanding, and I did quickly understand the differences between those two groups of people, yes.
I think you've said in your witness statement that past roles was moved to sit within your domain by December 2023. Is that
I
correct?
think it was around. It was. I couldn't remember exactly, but I'm sure it was as we came from the Christmas break into the new year, kind of the end of December. Yes.
And why was it moved within your domain, and where did it come from originally?
So originally, Owen Woodley had executive accountability for it, and then there was a couple of people that were set up to do the operational work. Yeah.
And why did it move to you?
I mean, naturally, there were investigatory matters which related to colleagues that worked in the business. So therefore, from an accountability perspective, it would make sense for it to sit with me. But also, I think I was probably, with respect to Owen, I was probably better qualified to take the executive responsibility. I probably had more experience in that particular area than Owen did at the time. So we discussed it and agreed that it would be better to sit in my area.
And how about Project Phoenix?
No, so Project Phoenix was with the John Bartlett's team, the Assurance and Complex Investigations team.
And do you think that division between the two is appropriate?
Do you mean the division in Project Phoenix between myself and that unit, or do you mean the division of past roles and Phoenix? Sorry.
Both.
So yes, in terms of the division of the two subject matters, because they are distinctly different. Ultimately, I think it's important for me to be connected and brought in on some of the matters relating to Project Phoenix, because after all, they relate to post office colleagues who have a contract with the business. Yes.
And are you sufficiently brought in?
Yes.
Could we please turn to poll 004483808? We're going to start by looking at the past roles project. We'll then move on to Phoenix. These are the terms of reference that the inquiry's seen before. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on it, but the first sentence there refers to the past roles project being established after the inquiry's compensation hearing in December 2022. Are you aware of why that was the particular trigger for this work?
My understanding is because of the judgments and that initiated the work.
Sorry, what do you mean?
So I think from the this is recollection. So I think it's from as a result of the judgments that the team was set up to look into this matter.
Do you know why the inquiry's own compensation hearing might have been a trigger?
I don't know. I'm sorry. No.
If we turn over the page, please, we see the risks that can are said to emerge. And this is a matter I've dealt with other witnesses. They're set out there. Number one, criticism of employees, say on social media. Two, undermining the integrity of the work being performed. For example, giving rise to conflict or the perception of conflict. Three, undermining Postmaster or of the public confidence in the work. being performed by the post office or the specific team. Do you consider those risks to be an accurate reflection of the risks? And in that order?
In that order, no. I obviously can't speak to this confidently because I wasn't here at the time. I think all of them are considerations. The biggest risk of changes in this particular unit where most of these people were employed would be the slowing of compensation for postmasters. So I think that probably should have been the number one issue here.
Thank you. Thank you. Can we please turn to poll 004486615? This is a group executive report based on, the title is Past Roles Review, dated 17th of January 2024. Could I please ask you to turn to page 7? And I wonder whether you can assist us with this. We've heard evidence that it was originally, or certainly Mr. Jacobs thought that he was originally going to be sitting on this panel. We see there Mark Eldridge's name as Postmaster NED. Can you assist us with that at all?
Obviously, I wasn't there at the time of setting up this panel, so I wasn't aware actually that that was the case. So.
And if we could please turn to page 11. Is Mr. Eldridge, does he sit on that panel?
Yes, he does.
Paragraph 3, this is another passage that I've read to other witnesses. It says there, in terms of key themes for communications, in carrying out this work, we're acutely aware of the duties we owe to our colleagues and the views of our trade unions. We also recognise that in the vast majority of cases, employees who have performed such roles in the past will have carried out their duties according to the instructions given to them by the business at the time, and in the belief that Horizon was robust. Do you consider that to be appropriate?
So I think in seeing some of the thematic evidence that I've seen over my time in the post office relating to kind of the mistakes that have been made in culture, it isn't surprising to see that the reference to the fact that colleagues were acting under instructions from more senior people, that isn't surprising. It's very difficult to comment. I wasn't obviously here when these terms of reference were.
This is a report from January 2024.
Oh, sorry. Right. Okay. Right.
If we take a step back and look at the past roles review and the work that's being carried out, do you think that there has been sufficient focus on the risk it actually poses to sub-postmasters and, for example, those claiming compensation and redress, rather than, for example, the risks to current employees?
I think in my time here and in all of the conversations that I have had, both of those things have been a consideration. So it is true to say that the concern that people looking at our progress with this might have sub-postmasters and members of the public and other people is relevant, and it has been relevant to us, as well as the impact on the colleagues in the business, yes.
Could we please turn to poll 00448864? These are the minutes of a group executive meeting from 13th of March of this year. And I'd just like to read to you a passage or a few paragraphs that relate to the Past Roles project. They can be found on page 3, please. If we scroll down, we can see the heading People and Past Roles. Is this something you spoke to, or you?
So I sponsored the work. Nick Marriott and Simon Ricaldin came in to do the presentation.
Thank you. I'm just going to read to you a few passages and just ask you some questions going along. So SR is Mr. Ricaldin, and NM is Ms. Marriott. Simon Ricaldin and Nicola Marriott spoke to the paper, which set out a recommendation on the approach to be taken in relation to the past roles review and the staffing in the remediation unit in light of the change in operational context and political environment. Do you know what's meant there by the operational context and political environment?
Yes, my understanding and the conversations I'd had with Nick before she came in to present this paper were that it was quite difficult at the time, amongst other things, to determine the workload requirement and therefore the workforce planning for the remediation unit, because things were changing quite frequently. At this particular time, this is in the time of the mass exoneration and the change to the schemes as well. So what she's speaking to here is the changing environment, but also the difficulties faced by that team at the time and the workload. So operational in the sense that there was more pressure, more work, and some of the political decisions that had been taken at that time, which changed the work of that unit.
The third bullet point says it had been agreed that an independent panel would be established to validate the approach to the activity, and while it had decision-making authority, it was able to recommend potential outcomes as follows: no further action, reallocation of workload or activities, redeployment, additional assistance for employee well-being, or a formal employment process in limited circumstances. For example, where an individual in a high-risk role unreasonably refuses to accept redeployment or cooperate with the business. So the Past Roles project here is looking at those who had previously been involved in issues that the inquiry is looking at and who are still working for the Post Office. And these are the options that are being presented or were presented for example, not taking action, redeploying, etc. Is that a fair summary of that?
That's exactly right, yes.
Thank you. Ms. Marriott noted, the public perception aside, no direct conflicts have been found, and none of the risks outlined within the terms of reference of the Past Roles Review had materialised, and that ongoing uncertainty was causing upset with mental health absence as a result in some cases. Do you know what's meant there by none of the risks outlined in the terms of reference had materialised?
I can't remember, and I don't know specifically, but I'm sorry, I can't remember.
It says colleagues were rated red. However, if they were identified as giving rise to a perceived risk in terms of undermining the integrity and independence of remediation and redress work being done, and in those cases redeployment had been recommended. Since the review had been undertaken, there had been a significant increase in late applications, and the remediation unit work driven by current external scrutiny and the heightened awareness that was generating organisational design delays had meant an increase in colleagues who were deemed as red, and there was no clarity yet on the government's role in relation to redress going forward and associated processes and procedures. Are we to understand that by March 2024, following, for example, the ITV drama, there was an increase in number of people who were claiming redress, and the remediation unit was under great pressure, work pressure?
Yes, that's correct.
And the concern in the business, it appears, and correct me if I'm wrong on my reading of this, is that the work that was being undertaken in relation to the Past Roles project, potentially redeploying people from the remediation unit, would cause problems in that regard.
That was one of the balancing decisions that we had, actually, yes, and it was very difficult to pinpoint exactly what the load and therefore the workforce requirements of the team were. It's quite difficult to pin that down, and that's, I believe, one of the other reasons that's led to it taking longer than it should have taken.
Simon Recordin and Nicola Marriott noted the implications arising from a reduction in headcount and the risks posed to redress claim processing times. The recommendation to the SEG, therefore, was to take a many-to-few approach to redesigning the organisational structure within the remediation unit. The approach would see the number of red employees reduce and the appointment of new recruits to undertake work at a different lower grade, albeit the transition would need to be done over time to help mitigate the risk to redress claims processing times. Can you assist us with what the suggestion is there, please?
I think we were acutely aware that the last thing that we could do was slow down compensation, and therefore changes to the structure in that unit, taking away people that, notwithstanding the perception of their involvement in work that is of interest to the inquiry and had led to Postmaster prosecution, that they had experience and knowledge, and we already had a gap in corporate knowledge that was essential not to slow down redress, and that was the forefront of our mind.
So were you balancing out a risk? On the one hand, you had a risk that those who were previously involved in issues being examined by the inquiry would still be employed within the remediation team. But on the other side, you had potential delay if they were to be redeployed elsewhere.
Yes, absolutely.
It was recommended that the creation of a separate independent function should continue to be explored, and initially in discussion with government, as the makeup of any such function would depend on final decisions on the government's role in relation to redress going forward. We saw the government's role being mentioned at the very top of the page as well. Is there at this point in time a movement at the Post Office towards trying to put redress in the government's hands rather than in the Post Office's hands?
So I'm aware of, I'm not involved in those conversations, so I can't confidently speak to them, but I do know that those conversations have been ongoing and are another factor in us not clearly or haven't clearly been able to determine the resource requirements of the unit. So I think we're working blind to the decisions that might happen outside of our control, really, and assuming a business as usual approach to ensure continuity of compensation, the best that we can do.
It says, as the makeup of any such function would depend on final decisions on the government's role in relation to redress going forward. Ms Marriott noted that while she stood behind the recommendation, she would wish to emphasise that no conflicts have been found, nor had any risks materialised. The issue is one of perception. On this basis, Ms Marriott would personally advocate for no further action. So we have a many-to-few approach and we have a no further action approach. Can you talk us through those two different possibilities?
So the no further action would be exactly as it says there. I mean, we would do nothing effectively with any of the people that worked in the remediation unit. They would continue in their role and they would stay as it is. Nothing would be any different. The many-to-few approach would be a restructuring, reorganisation approach that is a redundancy, effectively. This is a Post Office terminology that I only became familiar with very recently, but the many-to-few approach is the decreasing or kind of diminishing of a business unit, and therefore the compulsory redundancy that would be associated with that. That's the terminology for it. So it goes from, I think, the extreme of doing nothing at all to making people in that business unit redundant on a compulsory basis.
Mr Recaldon and Ms Marriott left the meeting so that the SEG could discuss the recommendations. The SEG discussed the difficult trade-offs at play, with a majority voting for the many-to-few recommendation. And then it has a footnote. If we could scroll down, we can see the footnote. It says, NR, CB and KS voted for option 3, many-to-few. OW voted for option 2, no further action, and it says that you abstained on the basis that option 3 that's the many to few, had the majority vote. Can you assist us with what your view actually was at that time?
So my view at the time, and the reason for not abstaining, was to delay the process any further. My view at the time was we just needed to do something. And it was clear that it had already taken too long. So I had a strong view that something did need to be done. Therefore, I wasn't firmly of the view that nothing should happen. I could see that clearly something had to happen, yes.
And the decision was taken for option 3, many to few. Does that mean the team was made smaller in size, or what happened?
So this was the recommendation that was then taken to the board, which is why it was so important at this meeting that we got a decision, because I think by now it was, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this is the middle of March.
Yes.
And because the conversation had been circling around for a long time, and because we were all acutely aware of the internal impact and the internal perception, let alone the external perspective of not doing anything, it was becoming critical. I think this was the meeting pre the board meeting, and at the board meeting we were going to get the final decision and permission to move ahead and execute the plan that we are now, actually as I speak, we are now in the process of executing. We're not taking a compulsory redundancy approach, but we have resolved with a mixture of a voluntary redundancy approach and then a ring fence where we'll be removing people from the remediation unit, so they will be reporting in a separate unit. But we've got a period of time that's really critical, so we can hand over, and I mentioned earlier that they have subject matter experience, which is critical to compensation, and we don't want to lose that experience and knowledge. So there'll be a transition period where, but over 3 months or so, where that knowledge can be transferred properly so that the work can still progress.
So is the current position arising from this discussion and the subsequent board meeting that people are being replaced within the remediation unit? And if so, do you see any risks to the prompt payment of compensation and redress to sub-postmasters arising from that?
So I'm confident that we cross-functionally have all of the right plans in place. It's critical that there is this handover period. And whilst people may expect for it to happen very quickly, it's critical that it doesn't happen any quicker. It takes as long as it needs to take to ensure that the knowledge transfer happens, and only at that point will those people move away from the unit. So I think if that isn't enacted, then that there is a clear risk that there's a knowledge gap. And it has been really difficult to establish the specific resource requirements for that unit because of the change in, for example, the change to the schemes and what that might mean. And I think that drives the need to be constantly monitoring the resource requirements in that unit. So I think we're working closely as a people team with Simon Recalden and his team to ensure that he has, as a subject matter expert, that he has exactly what he needs to continue to run the function. But the redress and the speed of compensation is at the forefront of my mind and everybody's mind that's dealing with this project.
Could we please have a look at poll 004584447? This is a separate issue that appears to have been happening at a very similar time to these discussions. So if we look at these discussions at the group executive level with the 13th of March of this year, this is email correspondence from the 8th of March. Could we turn over the page, please? It relates to a grievance that had been raised in respect of Mr. Recalden around this time. We don't need to go into the detail, but we have there in the paragraph beginning with the word whilst, it says, whilst I do not believe escalation is required to the misconduct policy in relation to Simon, the investigation does raise concerns about the effectiveness of his performance, and a number of further actions are now needed to get to the bottom of and correct issues that are likely present within the function, including ineffective OD. Can you assist us with what that means?
Sorry, yes, that's organisation design, so the way that the unit is structured.
And lack of resourcing plan, as well as cultural issues arising from an us and them mindset within the leadership team. Can you assist us with the concerns that are being raised there?
So can I just take a minute to remind myself of this
Absolutely.
paragraph? So there are a couple of issues. So the original complaint that had been initiated was regarding the disproportionate number of people that were incumbent post office colleagues vis-a-vis the number of contingent workers, so contractor workers, and that's why I think I'm referring here to the setup of the business unit and the function. And it was clear that there was a need to have a better resourcing plan. And I've spoken to the kind of volatility and the challenges relating to that. But it was really important that we were clear so that we could help Simon and the team. We were clear about exactly what was needed in that function to run the compensation scheme process effectively. And at that time, I offered some support with one of the people team who had expertise in both organisation design and resourcing to help Simon and the team to have more effective plans.
That was in March of this year. Do you think that the team now, the remediation unit, has sufficient resources, sufficient expertise, sufficient quality individuals to address the issues of compensation and redress?
So did you say the remediation units? Apologies, I missed
Yes.
hear the first part of your statement. So would you mind repeating the questions?
Do you think that looking at the issues that were being raised as at March of this year, by the present time, do you think sufficient has been done to ensure that that unit has sufficient people, sufficient quality, sufficient expertise in respect of compensation and redress?
So I think in terms of the people required, as far as all of us can tell now, we are in a much stronger place in terms of resourcing requirements. I think, as you previously asked me about the moving of people in the past roles population and that potential knowledge loss, I mean, as long as we mitigate for that, I think that the people operationally that are doing the job are capable, and I think we have enough people. I think it is a moving feast because of the changes to schemes, and as long as we can keep on top of those changes, I think that will be helpful. We are supporting Simon and the team, so there are other members of the leadership team that are also helping in this function, in this unit as well, to ensure that we've got the right level of capability there. Yeah.
And looking at the concerns that are raised here regarding ineffective OD, lack of resourcing plan, and cultural issues, to what extent do you consider those may have impacted negatively on the speed of compensation and redress?
And I don't think we found any evidence that has happened to this point in time. But I think in answering the question as best as I'm able to answer it, if the design of the function and the way that the function and the people within it are working together is not as good as it should be and is not best practice, then that has the potential to be ineffective. And in this case, obviously what we're asking this unit to do is make compensation payments. So I think it has the potential for it to have had an effect, but we're not aware that it has.
And are you aware of anybody looking into those matters further?
Yes, so this is a constant point of discussion, and the operation of this is a constant point of discussion and focus, and our recently appointed group general counsel that's accountable for this area is very focused on it. So him and the team are giving this a lot of attention.
Thank you.
Can I just try and understand the scale of what we're talking about? First of all, in terms of the approximate numbers of people who have been working in the remediation unit, but in inverted commas, it's now thought appropriate that they should not be.
Yes.
How many actual numbers are we talking about?
But the actual number, and it's taken quite a long time to get to this point,
Yeah.
so sorry for my deliberation, but the actual number is 27 people.
Right, okay. And that's out of approximately how many?
Approximately 110, but that's approximate. So
Right, okay, so I got that. And so far as the schemes with which the remediation unit is concerned, followers of this inquiry will know that on occasions I've been struggling to keep abreast of the various schemes that have come into existence. The Post Office Remediation Unit, does it deal with, I believe there are now 4 schemes.
yes, I believe before.
So it deals with all of them.
Yes.
Fine, right.
The 4, but there are more than 4 schemes. So I might, to the best of my understanding, I'm definitely not the expert here, but I'm
No.
pretty certain it's 4, yes.
All right. Let me name them so that I'm sure I'm on the ball. There's what I'll call the first one, the shortfall scheme. That was the first one in time. Then there was a scheme when people's convictions started to be quashed by the Court of Appeal. We've called it the overturned conviction scheme. Then there was a scheme to provide further compensation to the members of the GLO.
Yes.
And now there is a scheme to compensate those people who've been, use the word, exonerated by Act of Parliament.
Yes.
Is that it, or are there more that I'm missing?
There's also a process, a post office process review scheme. I'm sorry, I'm definitely not the
All
subject
right.
matter expert, but
Well-
sorry, there is a scheme regarding I think it's the process.
We've got
Sorry.
lots of people.
Apologies, somebody more qualified than me to answer that question.
Anyway,
I'm sure.
that's fine. We'll get to the bottom of it. But I'm right at least that there are 4 at least.
Yes.
And there may be at least one more.
Yes.
Fine. All right.
Moving on now from past roles to Project Phoenix, we've heard a suggestion in evidence, I think from Mr. Staunton, suggesting that Project Phoenix was allowed to go into the long grass by Mr. Foat. What's your view on that?
Can I answer that question in 2 parts, if I might? This might be easier for me to answer. So, at the time of Mr. Staunton making that accusation, Ben Foat was not responsible for that unit, and so therefore, by nature, wasn't responsible for the investigations. So I think that was an error made by Mr. Staunton. I don't think he understood the structure of the business at that time, but Ben Foat wasn't actually responsible. In terms of the perception that it had been kicked into the long grass, I think there was just process failings and communication failings, and I don't think, to the best of my belief, that anybody had intended to kick that into the long grass. It's hugely complicated, and it's not straightforward.
What is your view on whether people should be suspended while they're being investigated rather than continuing to work within the business?
Specifically in relation to Project Phoenix,
Yes.
or are you saying generally? So my view on suspension is that it's a necessary form of action when an investigation is taking place. I think the bar on suspension is now far higher than it was, and obviously we're bound by ACAS guidelines, which is that generally we would use suspension where an investigation was going to be a brief period of time. I think in the case of Project Phoenix, the decision was taken not to suspend for that reason, because I don't think, I wasn't there at the time, but to the best of my understanding, and I know to be the case, the decision was taken not to suspend because we didn't deem that it would be a brief period of time and a brief investigation. That being said, with hindsight, I do think it may have been better to have made suspensions in this case, yes.
Are you able to assist us with whether you think sufficient progress has now been made in relation to Project Phoenix?
So yes, I do believe that sufficient progress has been made, and internally we are confident. Again, this isn't necessarily right within my remit, but I do know, and I'm associated with the programme and quite close to it. So I'm sure that we're going to be concluding our processes by the end of this year, at the end of the calendar year.
And why are you sure about that?
I just know that that's how far the investigations have progressed. So I'm clear. I'm kept updated about that regularly.
And are you able to assist us with the current position as things stand as at today?
So the current position is that there are 3 colleagues that are in scope as part of this process. I'm not sure whether the inquiry is aware of that, but that is factually accurate. And we have conducted full investigations into the allegations, bearing in mind that the colleagues involved here were subject to specific allegations of wrongdoing. So there's been a thorough internal investigation which has been conducted by the Assurance and Complex Investigations team. They're at the almost concluding part of that investigatory process into the individuals that are in scope currently.
Thank you. There's one final document I'd like to ask you about before moving to questions from core participants, and that's poll 004487888. This is a letter that was drawn to the inquiry's attention by Mr. Ismail, although he wasn't aware of the author of this letter. This is a letter from, if we scroll down, from Graham Brander, who it has there listed as the network provision lead. Are you aware that Mr. Brander investigated Joe Hamilton, Julian Wilson, Lynette Hutchings, and others?
No, I wasn't aware. It's the first time that I've come across this. No, I wasn't aware, no.
Thank you. That particular document can come down. Are you aware of individuals who formerly worked for the Post Office being rehired? Mr. Brander, for example, was rehired in 2019. Is that something that you are aware of?
Not at all, no.
Do you have any concerns that there are those who are actively working at the Post Office in matters, in roles relating to sub-postmasters or relating to investigations who do bear some responsibility for what has happened in the past?
So I'm not aware of any individuals, but I am of the strong belief that if there had been any allegations of any form of wrongdoing by any individuals, then of course it'd been completely inappropriate for them to be working at the Post Office.
And are you aware of anybody who is working at the Post Office?
So save for the people that are in the population that are a matter of our investigations for allegations of wrongdoing specifically, no, I'm not aware of anybody at all.
So you're aware of 3 people, effectively?
Yes, I am.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. So those are all of my questions. I know that Mr. Steen has some questions. I think that may be it.
Ms. McEwan, my name is Sam Steen. I represent a large number of sub-postmasters. And I've got a few questions for you. Can I start, please, with your own statement? Can I take you to your statement, which you should have? It's WITN 113-601-00. And within your statement, Ms. McEwan, I'm going to be asking you a question directly about paragraph 212.
Sorry.
You go to
Is it possible to have this on the screen, or is it?
Hopefully it will go on the screen. And paragraph 212, please. Thank you. So we orientate ourselves upon the paragraph. You say at the beginning there, at my interview, when discussing Al's absence. Now, the Al being referred to there is Mr. Cameron, is that correct?
Yes, sorry,
Okay.
yes.
Nick, and that's Mr. Reed.
It is.
Nick also informed me that there had been complaints regarding Al's behaviour, but did not specify what had been alleged. He also told me that a conversation had taken place between him and Al in early 23 regarding Al making an exit from the business as the relationship between them had broken down due to a long-standing employment dispute. And then it finishes, Al had then been off work due to ill health and was not engaging with the business. Now, help us understand this. You had, many years before this interview, you had worked with Mr. Reed, is that correct?
Yes.
I think 20 years ago, you've said.
Well, yes, but to clarify, we hadn't worked together. So we came from very different parts of the business. And as you'll appreciate, Tesco is a huge employer of 300,000 people, I think, in the UK. So we had never worked together. We just happened to be on a leadership development programme together.
Right, that's helpful, thank you. My question, though, relates to the appropriateness of this discussion at an interview. This is before you're employed at the post office. You're being given information regarding Al, Mr. Cameron, which is that there had been complaints about his behaviour, unspecified complaints, and that there had been then a difficulty, relationship breaking down between him, Mr. Reed, and Mr. Cameron. Should those sorts of matters be discussed in interviews prior to employment?
I mean, so for context, I think this came from the. I was asking questions about the setup of the executive team and the strength of the team. I was aware that there was not a CFO in place, and obviously that's a critical leadership position. And I was concerned that I wanted to understand, and I obviously wanted to do my own due diligence before joining the business. So it was important that I understood the context and the operating context of the leadership team. So I think I'd ask questions about the whole team, and that's where the conversation came about. I think in terms of the appropriateness,
Yes.
there would be. I would hope that Mr. Reed would have known from knowing me 20 years before, but also known by reputation, that my integrity is extremely important, and I would never have divulged that outside of the conversation that we'd had and the confines of that. And the only reason I have done now is because I've been asked specific questions by the inquiry, so I've had to make that in my statement. But that conversation was in a trusted conversation between me and Mr. Reed before starting work.
I'll ask my question again. Should such matters be discussed prior to employment?
I think possibly not.
Can I move then on to a different document, please? This is a board meeting, or a document for a board meeting, which is this year, 27th of February. And if I've got the document reference right, it's POL 00447-854, page 1. And it's a board report that's being discussed, a 3-year people plan and people structure. So POL 00447-854, page 1. Ms. McEwan, again, it should go on the screen. I'm grateful. If you can scroll down the page, please, under firstly, if we look at those two paragraphs, you see where it says under executive summary, firstly and then secondly. Probably the easiest sentence to look at is under secondly. A strategic people plan has been developed focusing on 3 strategic priorities: colleague experience, capability and inclusion, to create a great place to work for all. And the high-level plan is shared with the board in this paper for noting and discussion. Now, if we wish to, we can go up the page. I don't ask for that on the screen, but this was a document presented to the board for February of 24 of this year, which is for noting only, essentially saying that this is what is happening. We are developing this paper 3-year plan. Now, you've discussed this briefly with Mr. Blake, But where this says to create a great place to work for all, in fact, the plan doesn't mention sub-postmasters. I can't even find the word sub-postmaster used at all within that plan. Help us to understand how such a plan that is meant to create a great place to work for all doesn't even refer to sub-postmasters.
So this is a question that I've been asked before, understandably so. So to the extent of my remit is to the colleagues that work at the post office, but I'm acutely aware and very focused on my role in providing a strong, capable collective of people that work at the post office so that they can do their best for postmasters. And I discussed this very point with the postmaster non-exec directors. So before I took this plan to the board, I consulted with Saf and Elliot, because I was keen to make sure that the work that I was going to do through the plan would make a difference for postmasters. And at that point, Elliot actually pointed out to me that it didn't explicitly say postmasters. I think we're intending in the statement a great place to work. And originally we just had it as a great place to work with a full stop. We've said for all, because by reference, that means anybody that is associated with the post office, we want it to be a great experience and a great culture for everybody. And that means for everybody, irrespective of the jobs that they do. So I think it's implicit. I understand it's implicit. And we're making real efforts to extend some of the work we're doing through this plan to sub-postmasters. For example, we've had several meetings recently where we've talked about the the behaviour framework that I spoke to earlier. We've started to talk to the postmasters about how that hopefully will make a difference to them for the future, and we've had quite positive feedback from that. And something like our service training, we're running a programme of inclusive customer service training. We feel that could easily be extended to the postmaster population, and we want to be able to do that. So it's not explicit, but I'm conscious that it isn't explicit, and that there is, as I said, there is a reason for that.
The postmasters and heads, I think they were the one that said to you, they came to you and they said that there's a problem with this plan, it doesn't mention sub-postmasters. Isn't that right?
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Did they come to you? Did they make that point? Did they say to you, Ms. McEwan, this doesn't mention sub-postmasters? You didn't elicit. You didn't go to them and say, look, terribly sorry about not mentioning sub-postmasters, did you?
No, I did go to them. It was my full intent to consult them thoroughly before I took this paper and the plan anywhere. And they are my biggest, most significant stakeholder. So no, I did consult them and I did ask the question.
Is there a 3-year people plan and people structure for sub-postmasters and branch employees?
Not to the best of my knowledge, no.
Was the possible inclusion of mention of sub-postmasters and staff at branches discussed with Angela Wolfenden, who's the external people and organisation design consultant who conducted the review? Was the possibility of mentioning them, even by exclusion, by saying that this is not meant to directly refer to those individuals, was that discussed with Ms. Wolfenden?
So I'm not aware whether it was discussed or not. I think with hindsight, as confident as I am about the intention of the people plan and the spirit that we want to go about this work, I think with hindsight it would be entirely appropriate and helpful maybe to reference specifically in future documents that whilst I don't talk about sub-postmasters and postmasters directly, the work that we're doing is absolutely focused on improving the relationship and definitely improving trust and communication with them.
Because you say that, and other people have said this, that the pressures of the scrutiny of this inquiry and cases and investigations have impacted upon people within the post office, so that people, are you okay? So people are concerned about the way that their behaviours may be viewed. We understand that, but there still seems to be excluding sub-postmasters rather directly, doesn't it?
So, arguably, in the work that I'm doing, I don't think there is exclusion. I think far from it. I think I'm very acutely aware of the need for the connectivity between the culture of this organisation and what it best does to serve postmasters. So every part of our plan is intending to do that.
In that case, I'll take you to a different document, POL 00458-463. So that's POL 00458-463. Ms. McEwan, that's our behaviours plan. Okay. So our behaviours plan, this one is July 24. Was this one drafted in-house, or was that one also outsourced?
So we drafted it in consultation with a management consultancy business that we were working with as part of the Ethos programme that had been set up before I started. So it was a collaboration between the executive of the Post Office, including the whole team, and this company.
Page 5, please, of that document. Now, we've just seen under the banner heading, creating a great place to work for all. This, if we can expand it slightly on my screen, it's very small. I don't know whether it can be just widened slightly. Under how and when to use these behaviours. Thank you. And if you can scroll down, please, to the employee engagement survey. There we go. So this is under that heading and descriptions, including questions related to behaviours in employee surveys to gauge impact on overall engagement, cultural alignment and colleague satisfaction. And then if we just go up one, please, from there, recruitment and selection to support what it takes to be successful at Post Office. We'll align all our behaviours to our recruitment and selection process. The definitions will provide a solid benchmark when hiring. Now, this plan does mention colleagues, including sub-postmasters, but it appears to be directly impactful for employees. Is that correct?
So yes, the intention is to provide a framework for the employees. I described in the past that, for example, there's been a lack of curiosity in the organisation. It's really important that we correct for that. We address it. So I think, yes, but by nature it would
Thank you.
relate to postmasters.
You come to the Post Office with a huge range of experience, background, longevity of employment at Tesco's and other companies. Is there a similar people person with your type of experience for the, I think it's 7,000 individual branch sub-postmasters and presumably a larger number also of employees? Is there somebody that's got your background, experience and ability to provide the focus within the organisation for those people?
Sorry, do you mean currently employed in the Post Office? Not to my knowledge, no.
You've mentioned that there is a sub-postmaster who has been brought in to try and provide an insight into sub-postmasters. But that sub-postmaster, unless I'm very wrong, doesn't have your sort of background and experience. Is that correct?
Has a different background and experience, but yeah, but not from probably from a cultural expertise perspective, no.
Just moving then slightly sideways to whistleblowing and the policies that are in place currently. Now, the whistleblowing policies I won't look at in detail with you, but they're not incorporated into sub-postmaster contracts. So there is a policy, and that policy essentially, if we wanted to look at it, says that sub-postmasters' whistleblowing comments will be received by the Post Office, although essentially the Post Office doesn't have to look at those because the legislation essentially doesn't take into account of contractors or non-employees. To assist sub-postmasters, would it be of benefit to them if the whistleblowing policy was incorporated directly into their contracts, so that there would be a contractual obligation to ensure that that is adhered to?
Yes, I would hope that, and probably hope isn't enough, but I would hope that the work that we're doing to ensure that people, everybody, postmasters and colleagues in the organisation, understand the benefits of having that policy and how to utilise it, I think is really important. But I think it's possible that we shouldn't over-rely on that, I think. So, yes, it may be helpful.
Lastly, you, amongst other individuals within the Post Office, have taken part in meetings with sub-postmasters that have been affected by the scandal.
Yes.
I think you've taken part in a number of those meetings, including travelling to Belfast. Is that correct?
I haven't been to Belfast, but I have been to several meetings.
Right. Okay. Where did you go in your meetings?
My meetings have been virtual, actually. So I've done 3 meetings and they've all been virtual. But I have done 3 of the meetings, yes.
I'm grateful. Just to finish, my questions for you, Ms McEwan. Can you comment on the impact upon the personal impact, emotional impact that those meetings have had on you?
I found the meetings to be personally distressing and hugely insightful. I think probably less important the impact they had on me, but more the impact that that what's happened in the past has had on those people and their families. So I found them incredibly difficult, but hugely insightful and very helpful to me in my role at the Post Office.
Excuse me one moment. Thank you, Mr. Cohen.
Thank you.
So I think those are all the questions.
Right. I'm not sure that I should be asking this question because I'm not sure that I've got the expertise to evaluate where I'm going, but I will ask it. In this rather unusually structured organization, where you have direct employees, but you have postmasters who are now, if they weren't in the past, certainly now said to be absolutely central to the business. Shouldn't they be under the function of someone called a chief people officer?
Do I think, sorry, could you just say the last bit of the question?
Yeah.
Sorry.
You've got direct employees, obviously,
Yeah.
but you've got other people who are contractually, in legal terms, bound to the post office, but acknowledged to be central to the business.
Yes.
The postmaster.
Yes.
And you've got someone called a chief people officer. And to my rather naive way of thinking, that means that someone is performing functions in respect of all the people in the business.
Yes.
So my question is, shouldn't the chief people officer have specific functions in relation to postmaster?
Yes.
So if I were to recommend that, you wouldn't think I'd gone mad.
I wouldn't. I would wholeheartedly agree.
Right, thank
We
you.
are starting to do work. That we
Yeah,
are.
no, I follow.
You know, we're making
But it
progress, but there's much more to do.
It's just struck me that, from, Mr. Blake's questions, Mr. Steen's questions, and there seemed to me to be an elephant in the room, so I thought I'd bring out the elephant.
Thank you.
Yeah, fine. Thank you. That's it, Mr. Blake?
That is, yes.
Right, well, thank you very much for your assistance to me this morning. I'm very grateful.
Should we come back at 2 o'clock? So.
Certainly.